Okay, forgot to have things all set. All right, hello and welcome back to Grockit's OGTV. This is the GMAT edition, unlike the SAT edition or the Grockit edition where we go through the questions in the Grockit database. My name's Jim Jacobson, and we are going through the official guide to the test, like it says there in the lower left. And we are getting towards the end of the book. We have gotten through all the quantitative section as well as 2/3 of the verbal section. We've done our critical reasoning and our reading comprehension and are now wrapping up with the sentence correction section. Last time we finished off with question number 21 on page 661. And so this time we are still on page 661. And we're picking up with question number 22. As usual, you do need to have the book in front of you because while I will read the question, I won't use a funny voice or something to indicate which section is underlined. And of course, since it is primarily a reading activity, I don't know that you would get as much out of this as if you were just listening to the broadcast without having the book in front of you, because you would be reading it on the real GMAT, not listening to it. Anyway, number 22. None of the attempts to specify the causes of crime explains why most of the people exposed to the alleged causes do not commit crimes, and conversely, why so many of those not so exposed have. And so this is one of those rarer ones where it's only a single word or a single kind of verb or something like that that's underlined. So clearly, we are looking for cues that tell us what sort of verb this would be. The two things that we would want to look for in this case, where it's just a verb underlined, is we want to check the tense of the verb and we want to check the number of the verb, singular versus plural. And then we also want to check for parallelism, because the GMAT loves parallelism. The two of them should get married. Those are the things we want to look for. First, and actually this is probably in reverse order, just because a lot of times parallelism stems from, or tense and number stem from parallelism. But in order, we can just do them in the order I wrote them down. First off, so we're talking about how attempts to specify the cause, none of the attempts explains. That's a present tense verb. Why most of the people exposed to the alleged causes do not commit crimes. Do not is present tense also. So we're talking about how people who are exposed to the causes of crime don't commit crimes, where so many of those not exposed are the ones committing crimes. And so it suggests that it needs to be a present, whether that's present tense. Potentially, it could also be present perfect, but the more likely case is that it's just the present tense. Just when we're dealing with, the question of tense in general. The next question, of course, is number, singular versus plural. The subject of that last verb is so many. So many of those not so exposed have. So many is a they, it's a plural, so we need it to be, there we go. Something's wrong with the computer has clearly decided to run a background process right now and wants to make everything all jerky. Okay, anyway, so many is going to be plural, and so we would want to get rid of anything that is a singular one. And then lastly, for parallelism, we want the verb forms to be as close together as possible, assuming they're in the same tense. And since we're talking about general circumstances, about what's true, that so many do this, while so many others do not. So do and do not would be the most parallel instance. So we probably want something that looks like do. So let's go through our answer choices. Choice A, have. It is present tense, it is plural, but it's not as parallel, so this one falls down on number 3. Choice B, has, it has the wrong number. Has is a singular. It's also not parallel with do not commit crimes. Choice C, shall, there's really, that one falls down on tense. That's the future tense, shall is the future tense, and so there's really no reason to say that, well, so many do not do this, so many others will, so that it's not parallel in tense. Choice D has do outright, which is what we were hoping for, and then choice E is could. There's no reason to move into that kind of hypothetical conditional could do this. Or, I mean, of course, could is also the past tense of can, but there's no reason why it should be past tense. So it's either wrong tense or wrong parallelism. So choice D is our correct answer. Moving on. Last one on page 661, question number 23. In a previous design, the weight of the discus used in track competition is concentrated in a metal center, but now it is lined with lead around the perimeter, thereby improving stability in flight and resulting in longer throws. So with comparisons, when you find yourself with a comparison and part of it is in the underlined portion of your sentence, you need to make sure that the things compared are parallel. We need to either compare the two designs, we need to compare the two weights, or just discuses in general, but they need to be the same thing. And in the the non-underlined portion begins with the word lined with lead around the perimeter. So who or what could be lined with lead? Very likely it is the actual discus. As opposed to, in the sentence as written, it's actually the weight that would have been the subject. The weight is lined with lead, and that just doesn't make as much sense. The lead is the weight. So basically, any of the answer choices that make the subject of the main verb lined, lined with lead, any of those that make anything other than discus the subject are not going to be correct. So choice A, in a previous design, the weight of the discus is concentrated, but now it is lined with lead. That makes the weight the subject, which doesn't make sense. Choice B, according to a previous design, and of course already according to a previous design as opposed to in a previous design is already wordy. The weight of the discus used in track competition was concentrated in a metal center, but now it is. And so once again, it is making the weight the subject, which we don't want. We need the discus to be the subject. Choice C, once designed with its weight concentrated in a metal center, the discus used in track competition is now lined with lead around the perimeter. So this one has discus, which is good. Choice D, the discus used in track competition, once designed with its weight concentrated in a metal center. Okay, so this one has discus. And it looks like choice E also has discus. So we've got it down to C, D, and E. The other thing that we can see in the differences between the answer choices is that choices A, B, and C end in a verb. We have is in all three. We have but now it is in A, but now it is in B, and is now in C, whereas D and E just end with the word now. Which one is correct? Let's just pick on E. So it would say, the discus used in track competition was once designed having its weight concentrated in a metal center and now lined with lead around the perimeter. So this one actually, even though it looked like the subject of the verb was discus, having its weight concentrated in a metal center and now lined with lead around its perimeter, E is back to having lined with lead, describing weight. So it does appear to make a difference what's happening at the end of the underlined portion as well. Let's check D. The discus used in track competition, once designed with its weight concentrated in a metal center, but now lined with lead around the perimeter. So this is correctly using lined with lead, modifying discus. The issue here is that it's one participle modification phrase after another. There's no main verb in choice D. So we have the discus used in track competition, that's a noun phrase, once designed with its weight concentrated in a metal center, that's all describing the discus, which was once designed. but now lined with lead around the perimeter. Another thing describing the discus, thereby improving stability in flight and resulting in longer throws, kind of expanding on the idea of lined with lead around the perimeter. We never actually find a verb saying like the discus, explanatory phrase, explanatory phrase. 4 explanatory phrases later, the discus is great. You know, there's no main verb in choice D. We still actually have to have an is or a was, but probably is, because is seems to be the right thing. Whereas choice C, once designed with its weight concentrated in a metal center, the discus used in track competition is now lined with lead around the perimeter. So there we have our is. So choice D had no verb. Choice E had no verb. Choice C is our correct one. And now we get to turn the page to page 24. So 662. Did I say page 24? I mean question 24. All right. In virtually all types of tissue in every animal species, dioxin induces the production of enzymes that are the organisms trying to metabolize or render harmless the chemical that is irritating it. So the first things that we notice, again, without really even getting too deep into grammar or anything, whenever you have an it underlined in the underlined portion, you need to check for pronouns to make sure that it can only refer back to one thing, that it shouldn't be, that the noun shouldn't be respecified. If you have two things that grammatically and plausibly could be the thing that it refers to, you can't use it. That makes it unclear. So pronouns, you need a clear referent, the thing that it refers to, and it also needs to be correct gender and number. I don't think you'll see too many wrong gender pronouns on the GMAT, but wrong number ones where you use they instead of it or it instead of they, those are extremely common. So we already know that there's a pronoun issue. The other thing that jumps out at me is that first phrase. It's the organisms trying to metabolize. The organisms trying. So you can use ing words. So in English, the ing word used as a noun, like running is fun, trying to metabolize is difficult, things like that. That's called a gerund, an ing word used as a noun. And they're perfectly legal in English. There's nothing wrong with them. The GMAT doesn't like them for a couple reasons. One of them is that sometimes they look exactly like participles, like the running dog is brown. The burglar climbing the fence doesn't know that the dog is waiting for him. Things like that. That's actually a participle, where it's a verb form that's kind of modifying a noun as if it were an adjective. Participles are verbal adjectives. Gerunds are verbal nouns. Anyway, sorry for the grammar lesson. Sorry if that's beyond you. If you are familiar with these terms, though, it makes life easier when you're thinking about these types of sentences. Anyway, so first we have to check pronouns. We also have to do this organisms trying thing. One way to fix it is to use a different noun in place of trying, like effort, or something. Just something that doesn't end in ing, so it's more clear what's going on. Okay, so choice A. First our pronoun issue. So it's an organism's trying to metabolize or render harmless the chemical that is irritating it. So it could actually plausibly refer back to organism, which is what we were after, but we also have dioxin in there. And so it doesn't necessarily have a clear referent, so it's a problem. And then there is also the trying to metabolize. So choice A is not going to help us. And then let's just look for the other ones that have it in it. Choice D also has attempt to try and metabolize or render harmless the chemical irritating it. So again, we have it in D, which makes it suspect. attempt to try and metabolize. People say, I want to try and get to the store before it closes today. Common in spoken English, completely unnecessary, and especially when people say try and do something, I'm going to try and go. Really, that's grammatically suspect. You can try to go or try to make it to the store before it closes, but to try and go to the store, again, people say it. In 200 years, that may be acceptable English grammar, but right now, not so much. So we can also get rid of choice C because it has the, well, actually, choice C doesn't have try and. Choice D has try and. Anyway, so that gets rid of the it. That's our pronoun issue. Let's talk about this organism's trying. So we have trying to metabolize. The organism's trying in A. We want to replace that with another noun that isn't a gerund. Choice B also has trying that it metabolize, which is awkward. So then C, D, and E all have attempt, which attempt is a noun form that means the same thing as a trying. So that's going to be better. Now we just have to choose between C and E. It is an organism's attempt to try and, oh wait, that's D, sorry. It's an attempt to try to metabolize or render harmless such a chemical irritant. Or E, it's an attempt to metabolize or render harmless the chemical irritant. E is clearly the right answer. The thing's wrong with C. Attempt to try. Attempt and try mean the same thing. You don't have to try. Or if you do, you are having major motivational issues. So attempt to try is redundant. Redundancy is the hugest offender of against the laws of concision on the GMAT. So saying the same thing twice, like previously in the past, that's the easiest way to spot redundant words. It's not necessarily the most common, but it's the easiest one to spot because you have two words that mean the same thing in the same sentence when they aren't needed. So choice C, try plus attempt dooms this one for sure. And then try to metabolize such a chemical irritant. Such, you can use such like that, but only after you've named it. You know, I can't even think of a chemical irritant off the top of my head, but this is a plus here, not a T. You know, such a chemical irritant, such can be a, can indicate that you're talking about, yeah, that one that I just mentioned by name, which might be some long chemical name. So that would be, it would make sense if we had been given that specific example already, but dioxin is not a chemical irritant. That's actually the thing that induces the production of enzymes to metabolize chemical irritants. So such in choice C is also misplaced. So try plus attempt is wordy, which leaves us with choice E. In virtually all types of tissue in every animal species, dioxin induces the production of enzymes that are the organism's attempt to metabolize or render harmless the chemical irritant. It's the most concise, it doesn't introduce extra words, there's no unclear pronoun, and we've gotten rid of the kind of sometimes grammatically difficult gerund in choice E. So 662, number 25. Excuse me. Based on accounts of various ancient writers, scholars have painted a sketchy picture of the activities of an all-female cult that, perhaps as early as the 6th century BC, worshipped a goddess known as Latin as Bona Dea, the good goddess. And we've had this particular format of question or of sentence before already in the broadcast, and that is opening modifying phrase. Wow, I'm just flying today on typing things or writing things correctly. Set it off by a comma, and then the noun. And you may remember that I've said that when you have an opening modifying phrase and then the noun, and one of the two things is underlined, or both in theory, the modifying phrase needs to modify the noun. The noun being modified by the modifying phrase needs to be as close as possible to that modifying phrase. So whatever it is that's in the noun spot is what's being modified by this phrase. In this particular case, it's the modifying phrase that's underlined. So that part's the part that we can change around. The part that we can't change around is that the word right after it is scholars. Whatever we have, and then the activity of the scholars. So scholars have painted a sketchy picture, okay? So whatever's in the modifying phrase needs to be possible to modify scholar. It needs to be possible that it can modify that. So can scholars actually be based on accounts of various ancient writers? No, they can't. Scholars are people and they aren't based on accounts of ancient writers. However, scholars could be basing it on various ancient writers' accounts in choice B. So they could be basing it. The problem is what it refers to. It is, again, we have that pronoun issue of having a clear referent. When you have an it, there should only be one it that grammatically and plausibly can that it can refer to. That could be the cult. It could be the sketchy picture. It could be the goddess. So there's too many things that it could be for choice B, even though scholars can be basing something on something, but they can't be basing it when we don't know what it is. Scholars, can they do something with accounts of various ancient writers used for a basis? Well, used for a basis, even if the rest of it didn't strike you as wordy, we have this perfectly good verb basing, in choices A and B, and then you don't need to say with accounts used for a basis. So choice C is clearly wordy. Choice D, by the accounts of various ancient writers they used. This one's less wordy than choice C, but it's still fairly wordy. I guess it's grammatically correct. Let's check E. Using accounts of various ancient writers. So scholars can definitely... the only one that really we could eliminate saying that it couldn't modify scholars at all is choice A. All the rest of them could modify scholars. Choices D and E, they could, the modifying phrase in D could be modifying everything that comes after because it's not, there's no participle adjective that's supposed to modify the noun. Anyway, but given a choice between D and E, using accounts of various ancient writers or by the accounts of various ancient writers they used, choice D stands out as clearly wordier, and really that is the only distinction between D and E. And C, actually, because C, D, and E are all grammatically correct. They all make the same amount of sense, but choice E clearly says the same thing with fewer words. Again, it's a little bit frustrating that things that are grammatically correct can be wrong on the GMAT. If that frustrates you, I share your frustration a little bit. On the other hand, would you want to read an entire report written by somebody who writes the way that choice C and D are written, with accounts of various ancient writers used for a basis? It would take you probably twice as long to read the thing. So they are trying to show you the elements of good style. Choice E, grammatically correct and most concise. So 662, number 26. Emily Dickinson's letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson were written over a period beginning a few years before Susan's marriage to Emily's brother and ending shortly before Emily's death in 1886, outnumbering her letters to anyone else. So we have a bunch of modifying phrases in this one. And not all of them are set off by commas, but even when modifying phrases aren't set off by commas, they still need to be as close as possible to the thing that they modify for the sake of clarity. Now, not every modifying phrase can be put directly next to the thing it modifies, but it can't have something else between them that it could also modify. So, a relative clause like, who was the tallest person in the family, that you can't put that after someone else's name other than the person who was the tallest person in the family, because then you would be confused about which one was the tallest person. So just know that modifying phrases in general need to be as close as possible to unambiguously refer to the thing that they're modifying, although sometimes they are delayed. Anyway, so that's one thing that we notice about this one. The other thing that we notice is so the final word in this underlined portion, we have words, 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 stuff. And then we have this word outnumbering. Remember, and there's a comma before it. Remember that comma and then ing participle, ing word, on the GMAT means one of two things. It either is modifying the word that comes right before, or it can mean one of three things, actually. It can modify the word that comes right before. It can modify everything that came before. And it can also go back and refer back to the subject. In this particular case, it could be one of several things. It doesn't seem very likely that the year 1886 outnumbered her letters to anyone else, so it's probably not referring back to the thing that came right before. It's a little bit confusing to have it referring to everything that came before this, so there might be an answer choice that clarifies that a little bit. The third choice is that it is referring to Emily Dickinson's letters, which would make a lot of sense. The other thing about this is that the bulk of all these words are just talking about the time frame that these letters were written, and the point of the sentence seems to be that because she started writing to her sister-in-law at this early date, she ended up writing more letters to her than to anybody else. So in general, the main point of a sentence should be the main verb of the sentence. I know that sounds crazy, but and then any other additional points that you want to make that are useful background, those are the things that should be participial phrases, relative clauses, things that you could cut out of the sentence and it would still stand as a real sentence. So in this one, the real sentence, in choice A anyway, the sentence as written, the real sentence is about, hey, this is how long she wrote the letters, whereas it may actually be that a better version of the sentence is that she wrote the letters from this time to this time, and then the main idea is that therefore these letters outnumber Emily Dickinson's letters to anyone else. Anyway, so choice A is a little bit ambiguous in terms of what outnumbering is modifying, and then there's also the focus of the sentence. So let's look for something better. Choice B, letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson were written over a period that begins a few years before Susan's marriage to Emily's brother and ended shortly before Emily's death in 1886. Let's just stop there. We have a change in verb tense, a period that begins and then ended. You can describe historical time periods. You could say the 1950s begin in 1950 and end in 1959. You can do that if you want, or you could say they began in 1950 and ended in 1959. You can't say begins and ended, a present tense and a past tense. That's naughty, and so choice B is not our friend. Letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson, written over a period beginning a few years before Susan's marriage to Emily's brother, and that ends shortly before. So once again, we have a tense mismatch. We have a period beginning, and then that ends. So it should either be beginning and ending, or a period that begins and a period that ends. For parallelism, remember, because GMAT and parallelism are buddies. Anyway, we don't have parallelism there. Choice D, letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson, which were written over a period beginning a few years before Susan's marriage to Emily's brother, ending shortly before Emily's death in 1886, and outnumbering. So this one makes it into a list of 3 different things that they were written in a period that beginning, ending, and outnumbering. It does not make sense to have a period outnumbering anything. All 3 of those ing words would be modifying period, the period beginning this time, ending this time, and outnumbering this body of letters. So that's a shift in meaning and into something that doesn't make sense. Actually make sense in English. So lastly, that gives us choice E, which must be the right answer. But so letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson, which were written over a period beginning a few years before Susan's marriage to Emily's brother and ending shortly before Emily's death in 1886, outnumber. So here outnumber then becomes the main verb. The main sentence is Emily Dickinson's letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson outnumber her letters to anyone else. That is the main sentence. So that makes sense. That's the main point. And then the everything else about these dates of writing letters are just kind of extra stuff. So 662, number 27. Paleontologists believe that fragments of a primate jawbone unearthed in Burma and estimated at 40 to 44 million years old provide evidence of a crucial step along the evolutionary path that led to human beings. Okay. So first one, of course, there's an idiom right away, estimated. In the sentence as written, it says estimated at. We have to determine whether that's the correct idiom. Then we also have, the other thing I notice is, so we have the subject of the sentence, bunches of words, and then the verb. When you separate the subject from the verb, the thing you want to look for on the GMAT is a mismatch between subject and verb, typically in number. They change the verb. Once you have a singular or a plural subject, and then they do the opposite with the verb because they've given you so many words in between the two that they think you might forget. So those are the two things that jump out at me. The first one, of course, is estimated. So estimated, the normal idiom is that things are estimated to be. And that's in the passive. You can also, so that's the passive form of the verb estimate. In the active form, you would normally estimate that. So, but in this case, the passive idiom is the one we're after. So these fragments are estimated to be 40 to 44 million years old. That actually allows us to eliminate actually four answer choices, which gives us D. So there isn't actually a whole lot more to say, but then there is also a subject-verb mismatch in a number of these other ones. The subject of the sentence is fragments. So we need a plural form of the verb. And in the original choice A, it says fragments provide evidence. So that's the correct form. Choice B says the fragments provides evidence. So choice B has the wrong verb form in addition to the wrong idiom. Choice C and E also have the words provides in them. I think they're counting on the idea that that people will think jawbone is the subject, because jawbone is singular, but it's fragments of a primate jawbone. So that makes of a primate jawbone just part of kind of modifying the word fragments. Fragments is the subject and is plural. Jawbone is singular, and they're counting on people taking B, C, and E as modifying that. Anyway, choice D, for those two reasons, has the correct idiom, estimated to be, and also has the correct verb form, a plural verb form to go with the subject fragments. And sometimes knowing the right idiom can allow you to eliminate 4 of the 5 answer choices. So page 662, number 28. Building on civilizations that preceded them in coastal Peru, the Mochica developed their own elaborate society based on cultivating such crops like corn and beans and the harvesting of fish and shellfish and exploiting other wild and domestic resources. Okay. So the first thing that should jump out at us is that it's a list. They do 3 different things: cultivating, harvesting, and exploiting. So lists mean parallelism. Another thing that jumps out is such crops like corn and beans. Normally, I mean not even normally, correctly, the correct form is such X as Y, not like. When you're giving specific examples of things, you use such and then, such examples as, corn and beans or whatever. Like is when you are giving analogies but not using the things that you are using after the word like as your specific examples. So when you say, I want a car like that one, you are referring to basically any other car that is like that one other than that one. When you say a car such as that one, you could actually include that car in your set of cars you are willing to accept. So we have first our list, second correct use of such versus such without like. Actually, that's probably a good start. Let's start off with a list and parallelism. So parallelism does go pretty deep to the point of even, you want them to, it's not that everything needs to look exactly the same, but they all need to be in the same format. So we have cultivating, the harvesting, and exploiting. If you're going to have the in front of the second item on the list, you should have the in front of all of them. So you could say the X, Y, and Z, but if you say X, the Y, and Z, it actually needs to be the X, the Y, and the Z. So the parallelism can begin after the word the or before the word the, but if it's before, then it needs to be in all of the elements on the list. So choice A, not parallel. Choice B, based on the cultivation of such crops as corn and beans. Okay, so that's got the correct parallelism, and it has our such and as. The harvesting of fish and seafood, and the exploitation of. Okay, so that is possible. Choice C, basing it on the cultivation of crops like corn and beans, harvesting of fish and seafood, and the exploiting. So we lack parallelism in C, and we also have the like problem. We want to use corn and beans as things that they actually grew, not that they grew things that are similar to corn and beans but are not actually corn and beans. So it's not C. D, they based it on their cultivation of crops, such as corn and beans, the harvest of fish, and exploiting. So not parallel. Yep, but we do have the correct such as. But not being parallel is still enough to be wrong. Choice E, they based it on their cultivating such crops like corn and beans, their harvest of fish and shellfish, and they exploited. If they had had their exploitation as that third one, it would have been parallel, but they don't, so it's not. Also, it also has the such like problem, which is naughty. So like appears in choice E, which is also wrong. Taking us back to B, based on the cultivation of such crops as corn and beans, the harvesting of fish and seafood, and the exploitation of. It is a little bit weird that they shift between fish and shellfish, and then fish and seafood. Not sure what to make of that. I wonder if they even noticed that. Or it could just be one of those false distinctions, a false split, like one is somehow more correct than the other. If anything, fish is often included in seafood, so it's a little suspect that that's in the right answer. But anyway, choice B is our correct answer. And on to page 663, where we will move on to the exciting question number 29. The end of the 18th century saw the emergence of prize stock breeding, with individual bulls and cows receiving awards, fetching unprecedented prices, and excited enormous interest whenever they were put on show. So, once again, this should jump out at you as being a list, and lists need to be parallel. The two items we have in the list are receiving awards we have fetching unprecedented prices, And then the third one is the one that's underlined. Now, in order for parallelism, we can basically already predict receiving awards, fetching prices, it should be exciting enormous interest for maximum parallelism. The original answer has excited, which doesn't make sense. It's not parallel. And actually, we can just go down the list. We have choice C is actually the one that has exciting. That's the one that is the most parallel. Let's just look at the other ones. Choice B has it excited. Who knows what it is referring to? That's a rhetorical question. I don't either. That can't be it. Choice D would excite. There's no reason for it to be either conditional or the past tense of the verb will. So strange verb form. And then it had excited. Again, we have it, which is mysterious, and also had excited. There's no reason for us to use the past perfect. So it's not E. It is, in fact, answer choice C. So still page 663, number 30. For members of the 17th century Ashanti nation in Africa, animal hide shields with wooden frames were essential items of military equipment, a method to protect warriors against enemy arrows and spears. Now, the main issue here is that when we have, is that our final part of the sentence, so we have our items of military equipment, and then we rename what those items of military equipment are. By putting a comma there and then another noun, we are renaming what that is. A method. Can we really rename items of equipment a method? I suppose you could come up with a sufficiently convoluted situation where a collection of items could constitute a method of something. This, however, is not one of those cases. Items are not a method. A method is a procedure or a way of doing things. Physical items can't be that. So whatever is in the correct answer choice, it can't be a method. Choices A and B both have method, which isn't going to help us. Then we have basically different versions of moving directly to the idea of protection, that these items are protection. We have, they are items protecting warriors against enemy arrows and spears. Okay, so that's possible. We have choice D, items of military equipment as a protection of warriors against enemy arrows. As a protection. It's weird to have as a protection after a comma, though. So comma as a protection. If you want to say that something is acting as something else, you don't normally put a comma before that thing. So, with my dog as a guide. You would not say with my dog, comma, as a guide. In fact, if you do that, as a guide, would go back to the subject of the sentence of what I did. I did it. I did it with my dog as a guide, or it could refer to actually the whole thing too. But without the comma, the dog is the one who's the guide. So because we have the comma in the not underlined portion of the sentence, renaming the items as a protection is not going to work with the comma there. Choice E, items of military equipment, comma, to protect warriors. We can't follow an infinitive. We can't start a clause like that with the infinitive unless we are talking about using the infinitive as the subject of a clause. To run is a delight. To bicycle to work is difficult in the winter. Things like that. You can do that in English, but to protect here doesn't actually function as a noun because there's no verb after the comma. So to protect can't work here because it's got the infinitive with a comma before it. It could have actually worked without the comma, we could say they are items to protect warriors, where it's an expression of purpose. But again, it's that comma in both cases, in both D and E, that really messes things up and makes D and E not possible, and choice C the only correct answer, which is also the most concise answer. So even if the rest of this had boggled you, the most concise answer is as good a way of choosing something as any. Okay. Number 31. No. Yes, number 31. 663, 31. Unlike the conviction held by many of her colleagues that genes were relatively simple and static, Barbara McClintock adhered to her own more complicated ideas about how genes might operate, and in 1983, at the age of 81, was awarded a Nobel Prize for her discovery that the genes in corn are capable of moving from one chromosomal site to another. Okay, now we really only have to care about the beginning of this sentence, so while that's a long sentence, most of it doesn't matter. And in fact, what we have is the classic opening modifying phrase and then a noun. In this case, it's the opening modifying phrase that has our underlined portion. And the noun is set for us. The noun is Barbara McClintock. So whatever the modifying phrase is, it needs to modify Barbara McClintock accurately. So, and we can see from the, since this is an actual comparison one, unlike Barbara McClintock, this. So whatever it is, if we're going to use the comparison model, if it stays as a comparison, we need to compare people to Barbara McClintock. We can't end up comparing genes or theories. You can't compare theories to people. You can only compare people to people. Theories and people do not have very much in common. So if the shift is away from an actual comparison, the modifying phrase still needs to modify her. So choice A has unlike the conviction held by many of her colleagues that genes were blah, blah, blah. That one's comparing a conviction to Barbara McClintock. We can't do that. That's naughty. So we need to compare a person or people to Barbara McClintock if it remains a comparison. Choice B, although many of her colleagues were of the conviction of genes being relatively simple and static. So this one isn't it shifts it out of this comparison mode where we say unlike this, so that's a comparison. Choice B changes that opening modifying phrase to kind of a contrasting circumstance. Many of her colleagues were of the conviction of genes being relatively simple and static. But, I mean, to be of the conviction instead of just being convinced, it could have just said many of her colleagues were convinced that genes were relatively simple and static. So being of the wow, there's so many words that I can't even say it very well. Many of her colleagues were of the conviction of genes being relatively simple. Definitely wordy, and it's not our right answer. And choice C, we have contrary to many of her colleagues being convinced that genes were relatively simple and static. So this one's more concise. Let's keep this one as an option. Choice D, even though many of her colleagues were convinced that genes were. Okay, so that one sounds good too. And then choice E, even with many of her colleagues convinced of genes being. So choices C, D, and E are all more concise than B. Do note that both choice C and E use that suspicious word being. Being and having are words that should set off alarm bells for you on the GMAT. And you should be looking to see whether there isn't a shorter or better way to say it without using one of these two words. They are right sometimes. We had an example yesterday where that was in the correct answer, but very often the GMAT will prefer that you say it another way if you can. So contrary to many of her colleagues being convinced versus even though many of her colleagues were convinced. The GMAT prefers finite verbs, verbs that, she did, he smelled, they smiled, things like that, prefers that to participle forms like being and having, especially present participle forms. Same thing with choice E, even with many of her colleagues convinced of Jean's being. So of Jean's being, I think we can eliminate choice E first. Because of Jean's being is just, again, this sort of ongoing state thing, whereas we want to say what they were because this is the past tense of a point of view. It just makes more sense to use a finite verb than a present participle because this is what the colleagues thought in the past. And obviously this finding that she had that she won a Nobel Prize for changed what her colleagues thought. I would hope. I mean, she won a Nobel Prize for it. So then we have a choice between C and E. Contrary to many of her colleagues, even though many of her colleagues, choice C and E, are the same up to that point, so we just have the difference between being convinced that genes were and were convinced that genes were. And the GMAT is going to prefer the one without being in a case like that. So choice C has being, choice D does not. So choice D is going to be our correct answer. And that is that one. Last one, page 663, question number 32. Galileo was convinced that natural phenomena, as manifestations of the laws of physics, would appear the same to someone on the deck of a ship moving smoothly and uniformly through the water as a person standing on land. So here's a good rule of thumb. If you see as in the underlined portion of your sentence correction question, immediately you should be worried that as is being used correctly for the different things that as can be used for as part of comparisons, as part of idioms, things like that. So just, that's one of the things that should raise flags. And sure enough, going through the answer choices, as appears in all of the answer choices, which means there's going to be variations on how as is used. The idea here is that, so we can get rid of the earlier as phrase, as manifestations of the laws of physics. So Galileo was convinced that natural phenomena would appear the same to someone on the deck of a ship, moving smoothly and uniformly through the water, as a person standing on land. So, so there's a comparison between someone on a ship to a person on land. With comparisons, the compared items need to be parallel. Parallelism is super key there, and you should make them as parallel as possible. So it would appear the same to someone on a ship as, and as is kind of your equal sign in the comparison. If you're saying things are the same, that's the same to someone on a ship as, and here's where parallelism comes in. We need to repeat the word to. The same to you as to me. The same to one as to the other. Okay, so the word to needs to appear in both cases for parallelism and clarity. Otherwise, actually, if we don't have the word to in there, a ship moving smoothly and uniformly through the water as a person standing on land, that means the ship is moving as a person standing on land, which I guess would be not moving at all. So without the word to, as takes on a different role there, and it explains the way that the ship is moving, which does not make sense at all. So choice A, definitely not our friend. Every other answer choice, B, C, D, and E, has the word to in it. So that only got us one answer choice, but now we need to see which one makes the most sense. It looks like, so let's just do B next. Would appear the same to someone on the deck of a ship moving smoothly and uniformly through the water as to a person standing on land. That sounds good. Choice C, would appear the same to someone standing on the deck of a ship moving smoothly and uniformly through the water. And then a semicolon, remember, basically is joining two independent clauses, two things that can stand on their own as a sentence. What it means is that basically each thing on either side of the semicolon needs to make sense as a sentence on its own, and they've just been joined together by a semicolon instead of a period to show that they're more closely related. This semicolon actually breaks us up in the middle of our comparison. It's right here. It appears the same to someone in the one position as to another, except we have stopped in the middle of our thought. I don't know if you're willing to just take my word for it, but basically the semicolon should never appear in the middle of a thought you're trying to do. It should be at the end of a complete thought. That's the whole idea, at the end of an independent clause. We could have split up the comparison somehow by describing the way it appears to someone on a ship, and then semicolon, then describe, hey, it's actually very similar to the way it appears as someone on land. But we have a very simple comparison phrase here. It appears the same to X as to Y, and you can't put a semicolon in the middle of that. Or not correctly anyway. So that actually just, the semicolon, just dooms choices C and E. We should not be dividing this up into two separate independent thoughts, especially because each of those independent thoughts then begins with the phrase just as. You can start independent clauses with the phrase just as, but then that is creating yet another comparison. You know, just as I intend to give you a present for your birthday, so I expect you to give me one for mine. You know, so just as can start something, but it starts yet another kind of two-part as construction. And we don't get that in this sentence. So choices C and E with their semicolons are totally out of the picture, which gives us only D to compete with B. What does D say? So it would appear the same to someone on the deck of a ship moving smoothly and uniformly through the water as it would to the person standing on land. So D has, we are comparing to someone on a ship versus to the person, the one. So it does have to, but then it also has to someone as it would appear, as it would to the person on the shore. What is it referring to in choice D? So Galileo was convinced that natural phenomena would appear the same to someone. Phenomena is plural. The singular is phenomenon. So we can't actually use it to refer back to phenomena, because it's plural, and so that makes this naughty. The only other it in the sentence actually would be the ship. So natural phenomena would appear the same to someone on the deck of a ship moving smoothly and uniformly through the water as the ship would to a person standing on land, and that's nonsense. So it's not choice D, giving us only choice B as our available option. It's also the simplest. It has the most direct comparison. The same to X as to Y. You can introduce other words into that construction, but there's no need to, and choice B is the most concise, the most clear, and also happens to be the only one that's correct. So choice B for number 32. That is a good place to stop. That's the question I promised that we would get up to. You've been watching Grockit.com's official guide television. We're going through the 12th edition to the guide, and we're making pretty good time. Next time we'll pick up on page 663 with number 33, and I'd say we're, what, about a third of the way through sentence correction? Is that right? How many are there? There are 140, so we're just shy of a third of the way through. Yeah, and so we'll hit a third of the way through next time, or a quarter of the way, sorry. Just shy of a quarter of the way through. Anyway, hope to see you next time.